The first thing I remember about that morning is the sound of my own heels on the hardwood floor. I'd bought those shoes 3 months earlier. Nude block heels. Nothing fancy. Specifically for the showcase. I'd tried them on in the store, walked up and down the aisle twice, and thought, these are the shoes I'll be wearing when everything changes. I was right about that part. Just not in the way I imagined. My name is Reese. I'm 28 years old, and I worked at the time, as a junior architect at a mid-size firm in Austin, Texas. I'd been there 4 years, climbed every rung I was allowed to climb, and finally, gotten the opportunity I'd been building toward since my second year of grad school, a spot in the firm's annual design showcase. Every year, the partners picked 2 junior architects to present original concept work to a panel of developers, city planners, and potential investors. It wasn't just prestige. The architect whose project got selected moved up to senior associate. Better projects, better clients, a salary bump that would have meant I could stop doing the math every time I filled up my gas tank. I'd worked on my project for 9 months. 9 months of late nights, skipped weekends, a social life that basically flatlined. My best friend said I'd turned into a hermit. She wasn't wrong. But I had a model of a mixed-use community center that I was genuinely proud of. Green infrastructure, affordable housing integration, the kind of design that actually tried to solve something instead of just looking good in a portfolio. My mentor at the firm, a senior partner named Mr. Copley, Aldridge, had seen it twice and told me both times it was the strongest junior work he'd reviewed in years. The showcase was on a Friday. My brother called me on Thursday night. I should tell you about my brother. His name is Connor. He's 32, and he has spent the better part of his adult life being the person our parents orbit around. Growing up, it was always Connor's soccer games, Connor's college visits, Connor's drama. When a girlfriend broke up with him, I was the one who figured things out quietly, got good grades, got scholarships, worked part-time through college. My parents told people they were proud of me, but it always came out sounding like a footnote. And Reese is doing well too. She's in architecture. Connor, meanwhile, could announce he'd decided to take up beekeeping, and my mother would ask how she could help. He called me at 9:30 p.m., which meant he needed something. Hey, he said. So, I have kind of a situation. He'd lost his job. Again. This was the 3rd time in 4 years. Different industries, same pattern. Connor got bored. Connor stopped showing up. Connor was let go. This time it was a sales position he'd held for about 7 months. He wasn't calling to process it. He was calling because he and his girlfriend had an apartment they couldn't cover, and he'd already talked to her parents, and apparently there was a plan. Mom and Dad want you to co-sign a short-term loan, he said. Just until I land something new. Probably 2, 3 months. I was standing in my kitchen in my pajamas, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold. My presentation materials were spread across my dining table. I had to be at the office by 7:30 the next morning. Connor, I said, I can't do that right now. It's just a cosign. You're not paying anything. That's not how cosigning works, and you know that. He got quiet in the way he does when he's recalibrating his approach. Then he said, Mom's really stressed about this. I told him I was sorry about that and that we could talk after the weekend, and I got off the phone. I stood in my kitchen for a few minutes thinking about how tired I was, and then I went back to my table and reviewed my talking points until midnight. I slept 4 hours. I got up, showered, put on the nude heels, drove to the office. The showcase started at 10. By 9:40, my project files were loaded, my model was set up on the display table, and I was standing next to it feeling something close to calm. Mr. Aldridge stopped by and said, You ready? I said yes. He looked at my model and nodded slowly, and that nod meant more to me than most things people had said out loud. At 9:55, the other presenting architect, a guy named Trevor, who'd been at the firm 2 years less than me, walked in with his laptop. He set up at the adjacent table. At 9:58, one of the junior coordinators came over to me with an expression I didn't understand yet. Reese, she said, quietly. Did you send a revised file to the display server this morning? I said no. There's a version of your presentation on the server it's corrupted. Or something. The renderings aren't loading. Everything went very still. I looked at her. That's not possible. I uploaded the final version last night at 11. I have the confirmation email. She looked genuinely distressed. I know. But what's on the server right now is different. It looks like something was overwritten around 6 a.m. I didn't perform panic. I went into a very cold, very focused kind of problem-solving mode that I've since been told is either impressive or unnerving, depending on who you ask. I pulled out my laptop. I had backups. I always have backups. I've been backing up files compulsively since a hard drive failure in grad school destroyed 3 weeks of work, and I had 40 minutes. I rebuilt the display from my local copies. It wasn't perfect. 2 of the animated renderings didn't load right, and I had to use static images instead. But the core presentation was there, and when I walked that panel of developers and city planners through my community center concept at 10:15, I knew my work. I knew every square foot of it. I answered every question without hesitating. Trevor's presentation was fine, solid work, technically competent, nothing that made you stop and think about anything. The panel chose my project. Mr. Aldridge shook my hand afterward and said, "Whatever happened with those files this morning, I'm glad you had a backup." Then he paused and said, "Do you know what happened with those files?" I told him I was going to find out. The IT coordinator pulled the server logs that afternoon. Someone had accessed the display server remotely at 6:08 a.m. using a guest credential that had been issued 2 weeks earlier for a vendor meeting. The files had been replaced, not deleted, replaced, which took a deliberate action, with a version of my project that was missing the rendering assets. It looked like a legitimate upload. If the coordinator hadn't caught it, and if I hadn't had backups, I would have walked into that showcase with a broken presentation. I stared at that timestamp for a long time. 6:08 a.m. I thought about Connor calling me the night before. I thought about how uncharacteristically calm he'd been when I said no. I thought about the fact that Connor had visited me at my office exactly once, about 8 months ago, when he'd stopped by to see where I worked. And I'd given him a brief tour, including the conference room where the vendor guest credentials were sometimes left on a sign-in sheet. I want to be clear, I didn't know. Not yet. I had a feeling, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone. But I didn't have proof. I went home that evening and I sat with it. My mother called at 7. "Connor told us what happened with the presentation," she said. "Are you okay?" I asked her what Connor had told her. That there was some kind of technical problem, but that you handled it and it worked out. Something cold moved through me. "Mom, how did Connor know about a technical problem I didn't tell him?" Silence. "He just mentioned it," she said. "When?" "I've been at the office all day. Did he call you? Did he tell you there was going to be a problem, or that there had been a problem?" "Reese, I don't understand what you're asking." "I think you do." She asked me not to make things dramatic. She said Connor was going through a hard time. She said I'd won anyway. So what did it matter? That last sentence landed somewhere specific. What did it matter? Because it was so precisely the way our family had always processed my achievements. They happened around obstacles, not despite them. They were inconvenient. They were, in some fundamental way, beside the point. "It matters," I said, "because someone tampered with my work files before a career-defining presentation, and my brother somehow knew about it before I'd told anyone in the family. That matters, Mom." She told me I was being paranoid. She told me I was stressed. She told me I should call Connor and clear the air. I didn't call Connor. I called Mr. Aldridge instead. I told him everything. The phone call the night before, the request to co-sign a loan, the way I'd said no, the timestamp on the server log, the visit to my office 8 months ago, and my mother's slip about Connor already knowing. I laid it out as facts, not accusations. I said I could be wrong. I said I thought he deserved to know what I suspected. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Do you have documentation of all of this?" I said yes. He said, "Okay, I'm going to loop in HR and legal. This is a data security matter regardless of who did it. I want you to write down everything you just told me, with timestamps where you have them, and email it to me tonight." I wrote it all down. I sent it at 9:47 p.m. The investigation took 11 days. I know that sounds fast, but there wasn't much to investigate once the IT team started pulling logs with actual intent. The guest credential had been tied to a specific device, a personal laptop, and that device had been connected to our guest Wi-Fi during Connor's visit. He'd been issued the credential at the front desk when he signed in because that was standard for visitors. He'd apparently written it down and kept it. I don't know exactly when he decided to use it, or what he thought would happen. Maybe he thought I'd fail the showcase and be too demoralized to pursue the cosign question further. Maybe he thought the firm would blame a server glitch and move on. Maybe he didn't think that far ahead. Connor has never been great at thinking things all the way through. The firm's legal team contacted him directly. I was not in that conversation. What I know is that it involved the possibility of criminal charges for unauthorized computer access, a statute in Texas that carries real weight, and a civil liability for damages to the firm's systems. I know that a lawyer, Connors, presumably retained in a panic call to my parents, negotiated something that ended with Connors signing a document, and the firm agreeing not to pursue criminal charges in exchange for a formal admission and a complete cessation of contact with firm systems and personnel. My parents called me 3 times while this was happening. I didn't answer. I'd said what I had to say, and I was done performing normalcy for their comfort. My mother left a voicemail on day 4 that I have listened to exactly once. She said Connor had made a terrible mistake and he knew that. She said the family needed to come together. She said I was the stronger one and it was up to me to help everyone heal. She said, "You've always been the one who handles things, Reese." I stood in my car in the parking garage at work and played that message, and I thought about how accurate it was, and how it had never once been said with gratitude before now. What my parents did not know, because I had not told them, was that 4 months earlier I had reviewed my credit report. I'd done it routinely. I check every 6 months, have since I turned 23, and I'd found something I didn't recognize. A personal loan in my name, $14,000 opened 18 months prior. A lender I'd never heard of. A payment history that showed current, meaning someone was making the minimum payments, which was why I hadn't been alerted to a default. I'd spent 2 weeks tracking it down. It was associated with an address I'd never lived at. The application had been submitted online using my social security number, my date of birth, a scanned copy of my driver's license that could only have come from one source, because I'd given my parents a copy of my license 2 years earlier when they'd asked for it to help coordinate something related to my grandmother's estate. I filed a fraud report with the FTC. I contacted the lender. I started the process of getting the loan removed from my credit and flagged as identity theft. I hired a consumer attorney, a woman named Ms. Torres, who was efficient and deeply unimpressed by my family's behavior, which I found both comforting and professionally reassuring. I did not tell my parents I'd found it yet. I was waiting, with the particular patience of someone who has been underestimated their whole life, for the right moment. After Connor's situation resolved, I called my father, not my mother. My father because he handles numbers and he knows when something can't be argued around. I told him calmly that I'd found the loan. I told him I knew when it was opened, what it was used for. I'd traced it, eventually, to a cash injection into Connor's previous business venture, the one that folded after 8 months, and that I had already initiated the fraud removal process and retained legal counsel. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We were going to pay it back." "With what?" I asked. "You asked me to co-sign a loan for Connor last week because he can't cover his own rent." "Reese, I'm not calling to fight, Dad. I'm calling to tell you that I know, and that Ms. Pernis, Taurus is handling it, and that any contact from you or Mom about this should go through her from this point forward. I'm also letting you know that I won't be co-signing anything, now or in the future." He said, "You're really going to do this to our family?" I thought about 9 months of late nights. I thought about 4 hours of sleep before the most important presentation of my career. I thought about standing in a parking garage listening to my mother tell me it was my job to help everyone heal. "I didn't do anything to our family," I said. "I'm just done absorbing the consequences of what other people did. I want to tell you about the part I didn't expect." My mother has a younger sister, my Aunt Deb. She and my mother are not close. There was a falling out years ago over something involving my grandmother's estate that I was never fully told about, which in retrospect probably tells me something. Aunt Deb lives in Denver, sends me a card on my birthday every year. And once, when I was 19 and crying over a design project that wasn't coming together, called me unprompted and talked me through it for 2 hours. When everything with Connor came out, Aunt Deb called me. "Your mom told me her version," she said. "I want to hear yours." I told her. All of it. The showcase, the loan, the co-sign request, my father's response, the whole arc. She listened the way good listeners do, without filling the silences. When I finished, she said, "I'm sorry. You deserved better than that from them. That's all." Not a judgment about Connor. Not a lecture about forgiveness. Not advice. Just, you deserved better. I cried in a way I hadn't let myself yet, because I'd been in logistics mode for 2 weeks and I'd forgotten to feel anything. Aunt Deb also, as it happened, mentioned to me that she'd been thinking about her estate planning, that she had no children, that she'd been watching my career for years with a kind of pride she'd never said out loud. I told her she didn't need to tell me any of that. She said she knew and she was telling me anyway. I don't tell that part for the inheritance angle. I want to be clear about that. I tell it because it was the first time in a long time that someone in my family said I see you, without anything attached to it. The credit dispute was resolved 4 months later. The loan was removed from my report, flagged as fraud, and the lender referred the matter to their own legal team for collection against whoever had actually used the funds. That is no longer my problem. I was promoted to senior associate in January. I'm currently leading a project, a mixed-use development in North Austin, green infrastructure, affordable units. That is, in a lot of ways, an expanded version of the community center I presented at the showcase. Bigger scope, real budget, real impact. Mr. Aldridge said last month that he expects I'll be on the partner track within 3 years. I smiled and thanked him, and then went back to my desk and sat with that for a while, because I'd worked towards something like that sentence for a long time, and it was strange to finally be on the other side of it. I don't speak to Connor. I don't speak to my parents with any regularity. There's a conversation we need to eventually have, and I'm not ready for it yet, and I've made peace with not being ready. My therapist says that's healthy. I'm inclined to agree. Aunt Deb is coming to Austin in March. I've already made a reservation at a restaurant I've been meaning to try. We'll talk about her life, and mine, and things that have nothing to do with any of this. And that will be its own kind of healing. The nude block heels are still in my closet. I've worn them twice more since that morning. They're good shoes. I think about that morning sometimes. The sound of them on the hardwood, the cold tea, the presentation materials on the table, the feeling of standing on the edge of something important without knowing exactly what shape it would take. I was right that it was the shoes I'd be wearing when everything changed. I just hadn't known yet that everything was bigger than one presentation. It was the whole arrangement I'd been living inside of, the one where I was the reliable one, the one who handles things, the one whose needs came last because she'd proven she could manage without. I'd been so focused on building a career that I hadn't stopped to audit what else I was carrying. I'm not carrying it anymore. That's the part worth saying out loud. I used to think the hardest part of being the dependable one was the loneliness of it, doing everything right, quietly, without anyone noticing. But I've learned since then that the loneliness wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the moment I realized the people who benefited most from my reliability had also been the least careful with it. Connor didn't sabotage my presentation because he was evil. I've thought about this a lot. He did it because he'd spent 32 years learning that problems got solved for him. That if he created enough chaos, someone would step in and smooth it over. Usually me. Usually my parents. The system had worked so consistently that I don't think he ever stopped to calculate what it would cost him when it finally stopped working. That's not a defense of what he did. It's just the truth of how people become capable of things you wouldn't expect from them. They practice, slowly, in smaller ways, until the larger thing doesn't feel like a line they're crossing. What I keep coming back to is the backup files. I backed up my work obsessively because I'd been burned before. A hard drive failure in grad school, 3 weeks of work gone in an instant. That was a lesson that cost me something real, and years later it saved me. Not because I anticipated Connor, but because I had already learned, the hard way, to protect what I built. There's something in that I can't stop thinking about. The discipline you develop from your own failures ends up being the exact thing that protects you from someone else's. I didn't confront Connor. I didn't call him and yell, didn't send a long text, didn't give him the dramatic scene that part of me wanted to have. I documented everything and I handed it to people who were equipped to handle it. That wasn't passivity. I want to be clear about that. It was the most deliberate thing I've ever done. I've spent a lot of years managing other people's feelings at the expense of my own interests, and choosing not to do that, choosing instead to let the actual consequences land where they were supposed to land, was an act of will that took more out of me than any presentation ever did. My father said, "You're doing this to our family." And I understood in that moment that he genuinely believed it. That in his version of events, I was the disruptive force, the one who refused to absorb and move on, who insisted on accountability instead of quiet resolution. I had been the absorber for so long that my refusal to keep absorbing looked, from the outside like aggression. It wasn't. It was just me, finally taking up the space I'd always been allowed to occupy in theory, but never quite in practice. Aunt Deb said you deserved better, and that was it. No advice, no silver lining, no redirect toward forgiveness. Just a plain acknowledgement of something true. I think about how rarely that happens. Someone simply saying, the thing that happened to you was wrong, and you didn't deserve it. It sounds small. It isn't. The career I've built, the project I'm leading now, the promotion, none of it happened because the universe rewarded my good behavior. It happened because I did the work, kept the backups, told the truth when it mattered, and stopped carrying weight that wasn't mine to carry. That's the whole equation. There's no mystery to it. The outcomes followed the choices, and the choices were hard, and I made them anyway. That's the only thing I know how to tell people when they ask how I got through it. You don't get through it by waiting for someone to acknowledge what was done to you. You get through it by deciding that your work, your integrity, your future, those things belong to you, fully, regardless of whether anyone in your family ever says so out loud. The nude heels are still in my closet. I'm wearing them to the North Austin project walkthrough next week.